Good morning, church. All summer, we have been pursuing the heart of the matter, spending time on what really matters in life and in faith as we read The Heart of Christianity together. When we set up the schedule for the summer, the worship and program planning team thought about how to wrap up this summer series. And the courage of Queen Esther came to mind. What could we learn from her and her people about living into the heart of the matter for such a time as this? It's wild to think that when we made that plan, we were simply responding to COVID-19. George Floyd was still alive. Matt was still our senior minister. And no one knew what the heck a derecho was. We are not living in simple times, people of God. And it can be a challenge to discern where and what we are called to be and do when the ground keeps shifting under our feet. And yet we have stories of people living in anything but simple times. Stories of their faithfulness and of God's. Which brings us to Esther. Her story and the whole book are much more familiar to our Jewish siblings. Purim celebrations bring people together annually in a sometimes carnival-like atmosphere for staged readings, audience participation, hissing at Haman, and delicious pastries. If you are less than familiar with this story, the gist of what leads up to our reading for today is this. The Jewish people are living in exile, strangers in a strange land. If the story of Ruth we heard last week was about how the people of Israel received a foreign woman into their midst, the story of Esther is about how the Jewish people were received when they were foreigners in exile from their homeland. An orphaned Esther is raised by her wise uncle Mordecai, and they're Jewish. When the king dethrones Queen Vashti for disobedience, and that is a whole other story, he starts looking for a new queen. Beautiful Esther rises to the top, but she keeps her Jewish identity hidden. Meanwhile, Haman, a dude of bad faith and bad politics, has risen in the king's ranks. He's galled by the fact that Mordecai doesn't pay him enough deference and worships a god other than the king. So Haman hatches a plan to get the king to write a decree that will eliminate all the Jews. Haman plots a genocide. Mordecai is obviously grieved by this decree and makes a public protest and performance of his grief, rending his clothing, wearing sackcloth and ashes, approaching the king's gate so everyone may see and hear his lament. Esther sends a messenger to her uncle from inside the king's palace to learn what all the fuss is about. He sends the messenger back with news of the king's decree to destroy the Jews and asks her to intervene on behalf of her people. That's where our story for today picks up. From Esther chapter 4, verses 10 through 17. Then Esther spoke to Hathach, the messenger, and gave him a message for Mordecai, saying, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Here ends the reading. May God help us to hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Will you pray with me, please? Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So like I said at the top, people of God, there is a lot going on in this story. And someone in staff Bible study this week may or may not have asked the question, who chose this text? But I think Esther and her people have a lot of good stuff for us today. And I think that starts with the fact that Esther and her people are living in a complicated time. We know something about this, people of God. I encountered a quote from theologian Cynthia Bourgeault this week that hit me right between the eyes. She says, "We are not living just through an era of change, but the change of an era." So if the ground feels unsteady beneath your feet, people of God, or if you are feeling weary or uneasy, there is nothing wrong with you. It's a lot. And in the midst of all of that lot, God is at work. And there is a role for everyone to play. Did you notice that, people of God, in Esther's story? Esther may be the central figure, the one with direct access to the king, but everyone in the story has a role to play. Encouraging each other, praying for each other, stepping forward in courage in the face of fear. Take a look at some of the many roles at play in the story. Mordecai, for example, starts out lamenting and protesting injustice in the streets to make sure people see what's going on. Hathach acts as a kind of reporter and messenger, facilitating conversation between Esther and her uncle, making sure that the message doesn't get twisted or transposed along the way. Through Hathach, Esther has a conversation with a trusted person, her wise uncle, and he helps right-size her situation for her. She's in a place of power and privilege. She is the queen, after all, but also vulnerability. Her Jewish identity has been hidden, and there's a law that says if you go to see the king without being called, you'll probably end up dead. How can she use her access for the good of others, even if it might cost her something or everything? Mordecai helps her see that. Other people can help us hear God's voice more clearly than we might if left to our own devices. Mordecai reminds Esther that God will deliver God's people one way or another. The question is whether Esther will get to be a part of that. God's got us, people of God. The question is, do we trust God enough to be part of this moment? To step forward that God might work in us and through us. And as Esther contemplates the courageous act that is being asked of her, this civil disobedience that could lead to her death at the whim of the king, she asks Mordecai to rally all the Jewish people in Susa. She asks them to pray and to fast for 3 days, to concentrate their energy and their will and their hearts and their encouragement on the task that is before her. She spends 3 days in fasting and prayer too, honing her vision and her focus, setting her intention, so that when she goes before the king to make a case for her people, she is clear about the task before her and carrying the courage of her people with her. Mordecai does as she asks. He organizes the people. Esther does as she says. She finds her courage. She trusts God. She is carried by her people's prayers, and her people are saved. I think Esther has a lot to say to the people of God at Plymouth about the heart of the matter at such a time as this. She models how to trust God and commit to community in the face of transition and challenge and fear. No one is independent or isolated in this story. And if they are, Mordecai warns, it will be their downfall. All are interdependent. All are woven together. There are different roles for everyone to play, but everyone, absolutely everyone, has a role. And often, and one of the biggest roles that the people play in Esther's story is an often overlooked but very important role that we need our whole Plymouth community engaged in right now, too. What's that, you ask? It's prayer. We need you to be in prayer with us and for us, people of God. For your pastors and your lay leaders, for each other and for the pastors and leaders we don't even know yet, but who will come. Several of us in staff Bible study this week reflected on some profound experiences of this kind of communal prayer. Pastor Leanne described the invitation she received from a men's breakfast group at a previous church shortly after being called to be their pastor. They just wanted her to know that even before they knew her, they had been praying for her. Years ago, I prayed regularly with a friend who was struggling to find the next right call that would allow her to live and grow into gifts as a senior minister while also being a good fit for her family. We prayed for the church she ended up in for years before they knew her name or she knew theirs. There is something deeply moving about being part of a community of prayer that has set its intention prayerfully for what and for who comes next. Not just with its head or with the words from its mouth, but with its heart, its spiritual center. And here's the thing, people of God. Church isn't something that just happens to us. I'm going to say that again, okay? Church isn't something that just happens to us or is done to us. Church is something we are. It is a commitment to live and grow toward God in community. Prayer is an excellent reminder of that. It helps the excess fall away. It grows courage. It generates compassion. And it clears our eyes to see what is uniquely ours to do. There's only one Esther in this story, but there must have been thousands of prayers. So will you join your prayers with ours, people of God? Pray for God to continue to be at work among us, to move and grow and make us ready for who and what comes next. Pray for God to continue to be at work in the life of the one or ones we haven't met yet, for the person who will be our interim minister and the one who will be our next senior pastor, that they may keep growing and preparing to meet us where we are and move with us to where God calls us to be. Pray for our leaders and for our work together, that God may continue to work through us for the good of our community. Pray for each other, for courage and clarity and commitment through this time of challenge and change. And pray for yourselves, people of God. Wherever you are and whatever it is that you need in this moment, be bold to ask and bold to offer. Trust God, because God is at work, and there is a role for each of us to play. May we claim it with courage and compassion. Amen.